Okay, so we are live. For those of you, who were able to join, we are now live. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I can actually share the feed from YouTube to the group. Excuse me, but I'm kind of doing this on two different platforms right now, and so you guys may see me kind of go back and forth. And for those of you guys who are not familiar with who I am Lakianda Jefferson, and this particular stream is meant for the International Women in Psychology. We have a group of us, and I am our expert today. I'm talking about clinical documentation in the field. And the idea is to improve the efficiency and the time and um, eliminate the frustration when it comes to clinical documentation, because at the end of the day, it's kind of the thing that everybody hates writing progress notes, and it's how we get paid. When you're accepting insurance, it's a huge thing, and you want to make sure that your documentation is on point, HIPAA compliant, and it's appropriate for the work that you provide to your client base, right? Because your patients are important. And as I mentioned before, whether you are a psychotherapist, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, your clinical documentation is paramount as far as its accuracy and time efficiency is kind of like a huge thing too. It has to be timely, it has to be accurate, it has to give a general picture of what took place, of the encounter with the patient face to face. But the most important part is that it needs to be limited as far as a progress note. And so, as far as like our group, I will put like a small presentation together. I did make myself like some small notes, but I'll put a small presentation together so that you guys have something to actually refer back to other than the voice feedback that I am providing you guys with now. And that'll make it really easy for you to say, okay, this is how you do a DAP note, which is the most popular internationally speaking. And also a burp note. And we'll talk about the differences in the two as we kind of get into it. And they're kind of like the same information is in both of them. They just go in different places, basically. Okay. Mhm. And so I did introduce myself. I am a psychotherapist by way of marriage and family therapy. I'm a systemic practitioner. And so, marriage and family therapy is a form of psychotherapy. So, talk therapy in order to alleviate the signs and symptoms of variety of illnesses or plagued ailments with people that are diagnosable by the DSM-5 now manual, and that's this wonderful manual, and ICD-10, which we're moving into ICD-11 now. It's pretty used, right? And so we deal with and cognitive behavioral disorders and conditions um, that typically affect their daily functioning. And so we need ways of interpreting what their interpersonal and their personal agenda every day and what their experiences are like. And then, of course, what navigating that journey of recovery, if it's a substance related thing, or restructuring, if it's behavioral or emotional, and kind of journey, right, for them. We need ways of tracking what we're doing with them. And that's how we do that effectively. So, diagnosing and assessment, right? When it comes to the diagnosing and assessment piece. At the top of all notes, typically there is going to be a section that if you do your own notes, it's kind of like by yourself, you want to have a section for your MSC, your mental status exam. You want to be able to put, you know, whether this is what their mental, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, systemic state is, addictive disorder, or things, informational section or whatever, right? All right. And so there is something called the fluid chain or golden chain, right? So everything in the mental health record kind of links together, and everything in healthcare is a fluid chain of information. It flows. It includes the intake and assessment process. We talk about at the very beginning of the information, kind of like what we're noticing. If the client came in and they were alert and oriented times two, three, four, etc., what their initial what they're here for, what the encounter is about. Okay, so if the client came in complaining that today they're fatigued, today they had a long day, today they had a bad day. Recently we've had a fight. If it's a couple that you're seeing, recently we've been struggling with communication or we've been struggling with infidelity. This we're letting the insurance company know that this is going to guide what we're talking about. Okay. Um, Very important piece of information right here. It's considered the best practice to complete and sign your progress notes within 24 hours of the completion of the session. That's the time limit. So I'm doing your notes as you're going. Now, when it comes to um, what we say, attending behavior, you can still be very much still gonna take notes, do like some charting on a notepad or a tablet. Um, and taking note of the things that are vital to the session. For example, for example, if your client came in alert and oriented and was accompanied by his sister for the session, you know that this encounter is client plus family member. You know that this is going to be the code that you're billing out. You're indicating then what kind of session you're billing for, and you're also indicating that the the client's family member is going to be an integral part of the session, right? So then you're going to ask them, okay, what is the significance of you bringing so and so in for the session? Or maybe this is something that you've already talked about in your previous plan from your previous note. So you're noticing or you're notating that this is a continuation from a previous note. And it's an indication to the insurance company that your treatment plan is following suit. Okay, important at the top. Your progress note must also include your start and stop times because the idea is to capture the time because different codes equate to different time limits for the session. So a 15-minute, 30-minute, and times are kind of in those 15-minute capsules 15-minute, 30-minute, 45-minute, 50-minute plus session or 90-minute session, etc. The modalities and frequencies of treatments furnished. Those particular things are typically going to be on your treatment plan and not on your progress notes. And um, you can always include them at the bottom when it talks about your plan or the progress of treatment if it's a DAP note. And like I said, we'll talk about that kind of towards the end when I disseminate between a BERT note, which is behaviors, interventions, response, and plan, versus a DAP note, right? So, like I said, the DAP note is the most common, and the description of the major um, description of major events that are discussed and specific interventions provided go under the D, which means data in DAP. Your observation and assessments of the patient's status and their functioning are going to be the assessment part of the DAP note, and that's the A of the DAP. And then any plans for the future, like your homework assigned recommendations, additional resources, alternative treatments for your future of seeing the patient, those things go under the P. Alternatively, if you're doing a burp note, under the behavior would be where you include um, specific major events or topics that are to be discussed. So, why the patient is presenting, why they're there, what is the main thing they've been struggling with before they came into the session. So, the presenting problem, how they things that you're noticing. So, your observations and assessments of the patient's status and functioning, where you're putting that typically under the A, right? You're putting that there. So alert and oriented times two, presented with family member for the session, was on time or was running 5 minutes late and felt flushed. Patient was disheveled. Those particular things, they go in that top section if you're doing a burp versus a DAP. So it's a flip in the information where you put the information. Patient says that they've been struggling with adequate communication and been arguing excessively with the wife the last week. So, in interventions, however, on a burp note versus the DAP note, remember I talked about the specific interventions in a DAP note would be in the very first section. The interventions would be in that intervention session. That's it. That's all that goes there. And you literally will be like, nothing patient goes there. Patient did nothing goes there in intervention. And that's what really important with a burp note. With a burp note, patient, everything, observations go in the first part where the behaviors about the patient's observations that you've made, make sure everything is fact-based. So nothing that's opinion-based about you. So everything about the patient there. And an intervention is clinician helped consumer process this, or clinician created space for consumer to elaborate about the issues that brought them to the session today. Clinician probed about the arguments or the base or the foundation of the arguments and how many arguments they've had. Clinician helped consumer process the fact that it's better to have arguments, save the heavy arguments for sessions, and have the lighter arguments at home. Um, for response would be how the consumer received that information, right, from the interventions. So client was receptive to the interventions employed today in today's sessions and stated, I feel much better now, right? In quotes. It could be that simple. I'm going to talk about why in just a moment. And then moving on to the P is the same across the board. That's the great thing about the DAP and the burp note. The P is always going to be your plan. Homework assigned recommendations, additional resources, alternative for treatments. Additional resources means if you've connected them with additional resources or you've given them homework assignments to make additional connections like group therapy or to another provider. So psychiatrist, if you're a psychotherapist or a psychologist, if you're a psychotherapist, or if you connected them to a psychotherapist, if you're a psychologist, psychotherapist, if you're a psychiatrist, right? I prescribe medications for the patients because we changed medications from this because they were not responsive to the previous medication, etc. We're going to see how they do. Going to take this medication, POQD. You understand what I'm saying? And we'll see the patient back in a week. So that kind of thing would go in the P for plan in that section, right? if you're doing a burp note. Um, Client was prescribed to argue X amount of times with wife. See how that works when they come back. You want to be as brief as possible because the thing about a progress notes, and that's what these are, a burp and a DAP are progress notes. It captures a picture of what happened in the session for the sake of HIPAA compliant information being exchanged with the third party payer. So you're going to give this information to the insurance company. You also may provide this same information to the family members of the patient if they sign a release. You may provide this information to the patient. You may even provide this information to the family members if the patient were to expire, right? But you want to make sure that the information in here is limited, is brief, because when we're considering HIPAA, we want to consider minimum necessary to achieve the ultimate goal. Reimbursement, right? An idea of progress in therapy. And so that is the biggest part. So you want to be brief and to the point of where you're going, okay? In your plan part of both notes, you can notate how far the consumer has come in their therapy thus far. If this note is a note about, if this is a note about a client coming in for an initial assessment, an assessment note needs to look something like consumer showed up for an initial assessment for psychotherapy, initial assessment for medication management, initial assessment for psych evaluation, depending on which house in which you're employed in, right? Psychotherapy, psychiatric doctor, psychiatric practitioner, right? Or is a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And so patient was alert and oriented ×4 or ×2 ×3. Patient denied audio or visual hallucinations. So you want to make sure that you're asking all of those questions. You don't need to say patient did not report, right? So that says that you didn't ask the question. And an assessment means that you're assessing each area of functioning. That means you're asking questions and you're notating the responses. So in essence, what you're doing is you're notating the responses of the patient. And so what you're doing is you're giving an overview of what they are saying to you. So if patient is saying, or if we're doing a behavioral health assessment, right? The typical behavioral health assessment should start with history of trauma, common items that are essential. Even if you're not a trauma-informed provider, you should definitely assess for trauma history because it definitely is important to accurate diagnosing, because when it comes to differential diagnosing, you want to make sure that you're exploring the history of trauma, because trauma can be the thing that changes your diagnosis from one thing to another. It can make a person look bipolar, but they're not. They're DMDD. And so, or PTSD can make a person look schizophrenic, but they're not. PTSD. And so it's important to know the history of trauma. So you have to cover those bases and say patient denied auditory or visual hallucinations. Patient denied a history of suicide attempts. Patient denied inpatient hospitalization, say history. Patient denied a history of sexual trauma, those types of things. You need to cover all of those areas. You need to cover the patient's functionality and all of the domains of functionality of their lives. You need to go over that. And you need to say Patient presents with a history of sexual trauma. Patient presented with um, a history of whatever trauma they had, and there was an adequate treatment plan, created, and the patient will be seen in the plan part for 3 times a week until symptoms have abated times 3 or 4, have decreased from 3 times a week to 2 times a week. So whatever the treatment plan looks like, and you're kind of laying that out. And that's the most detailed as any of your progress notes should be, because your treatment plan should be kind of like your progress note for the most part, because you're submitting that in essence to the insurance company. But you're writing a brief synopsis of the fact that you've had an encounter. You want to know who was there. You want to know what you did. Clinician assess for history of trauma. Clinician assess for inpatient hospitalization stays. Clinician assess for a wide array of symptoms. Suicide attempts, administered whatever inventories you administered to your patient. And that should always include at least a PHQ-9 SSRS suicide risk assessment scale. And so you should always do those particular assessments with your clients to make sure that you have a clear picture and clear indicator of where your patient's thoughts and level of functioning are on an emotional, a cognitive, and a behavioral standpoint, kind of at the moment that you start seeing them, right? And so at the close or the termination of therapy, you kind of want to do the same thing. Let's see. Okay, so let's talk about what a progress note is not. Clinical judgments, conclusions, impressions, diagnosis that cannot be justified by accepted methods of assessment and treatment outside of the therapist's scope of practice. Let's talk about scope of practice. And so there is a huge thing when it comes to cultural variations and what we call cultural competence. So Reiki healing, spiritual practice related healing that has been introduced into psychotherapeutic healing, body psychology, those types of things. When it comes to using essential oils and other more natural or holistic DBT mindfulness training, those kinds of things, even though some of them don't include like a, how do you say, certification, right? Initially, scope of practice questions sometimes come up. If there is something that you are trained in doing and it proves to be efficient, make sure you are documenting the methods that you're using with your clients. And your efficiency is sometimes due to your culture, right? And so you're definitely within your scope of practice if you're doing something that is unique to your particular culture with your clients. So those acceptable forms within your culture are definitely acceptable in your notes, but it's important to, like I said, keep accurate documentation of what it is that you're doing, because you're tracking progress for the efficiency and for documentation purposes to make sure that you have a clear line to follow, to say this is what happened in these sessions and this is where we were and this is where we are. But you don't want to put your own personal feelings and put too much information inside of a progress note. Speculation doesn't go inside of a progress note. Personal feelings and judgments about the patient doesn't go in a progress note. Information and events and experiences, descriptions that are not relevant to the patient's level of functioning, treatment plan, identifying information about persons who are not directly involved in the patient treatment. Those are things that don't go inside of the housing of your progress notes. Now, there are psychotherapy notes, right? Your psychotherapy notes are notes that are kept separate from your progress note. And this is a really important one. So, psychotherapy notes are the notes that we use for tracking during the sessions. Like your patient is talking, and sometimes we can't keep everything up here because, like, we're not robots, we're human beings. And so, we're tracking with just minor notes off to the side. A lot of us use notebooks for that. But if you're one who uses an EHR for billing and to keep your notes and everything for your patients, then more than likely you're using your computers to do your tracking. So your psychotherapy note is definitely separate. All of those particular things need to go in your psychotherapy note, and you still want to be brief. Now, in your psychotherapy note, you also want to be careful because those notes need to be with they have to not include your patient's personally identifying information. So in those particular notes, it's really important that you identify like a patient health record number for your patients. And oftentimes that might just include a number or like initials, right? And a time date stamp, right? Something like that. And then you can keep them in double locked. That's the standard, the ethical standard across the board, in a location that you keep your files, your patient files. Remember, your psychotherapy notes are the notes that are not subject to be released to the courts or your patients or anyone else. Those are 100% yours. So it's for the therapist, for the practice. And if you're not in private practice, what typically happens, like each agency or practice has their own rules. And if you have your own practice and you employ other therapists underneath you, it's really important that you create a particular boundary as to how you handle that or intend to handle that across the board, because there are some psychotherapy practice that do not allow clinicians to maintain those notes for several reasons, and that would really require a whole separate video. But it's important that you develop some sound boundaries around how you keep those records, because even though they're required to be double locked, you want to make sure that those things are kept private, because that's very sensitive information. And even if you do have them under lock and key, um, and even if you're decoding them, or encoding them, somebody can decode them, right? And sometimes that's information that you don't want out there. So, clinical documentation is extremely important because you want to get paid. You don't want your claims to be denied, redacted, sent back to you from the insurance companies that are your payers, but also for you to track what's happening in your sessions and the efficiency of the treatment that you're providing to your clients. If you are prescribing medication, especially, it's important to know what your client is responding positively to and what they're not. Um, as a psychotherapist, the therapy is their medication. That is their prescription. And this is how you are keeping track of how efficient or not efficient the therapy in which you are providing to your client is to and for them. So you have to keep that in mind. Okay. So be mindful of that. Let's see. Mm-mm-mm. So I think that's pretty much it. I think on the group, I will post a brief example of each type: admission, discharge note, and a continuation psychotherapy note for both DAP and BURP. So you guys can see kind of what an ideal note looks like. And that's pretty much all I've got, you guys. I absolutely love you. Thank you so much for your time today. And for those of you who are on the IWIP group, that didn't catch this video on the YouTube live stream, definitely go through and check out the live stream. I'm going to see if I can share it on here after I end the stream and it becomes like a stored video or whatever. And then you guys can kind of check it out on your own time. But if you're not already subscribed, like, subscribe, share, all of that great stuff. And for other clinicians that come across and check out this clinical documentation video, I hope this helped, especially for beginning clinicians and other clinicians that are struggling for balance when it comes to concurrent documentation and just basically documentation in general, because oftentimes we're struggling about what do we put in this stuff? What are we looking for? What goes under each section and that kind of thing. And I think what I may do is even do like an example burp, because I know in America, in a lot of states, I don't know, I might do a burp, soap, and adapt and put it kind of in the comment section so you guys see what that looks like. Because that is something that I do see a lot of clinicians coming to me for advice on, because I do clinical consultation for other clinicians. And it is one of the things that a lot of clinicians struggle with: accurate documentations, methods for them to stay on top of things. And then falling behind is so easy, because I think a lot of practices don't know what it is that the insurance companies really actually need. There are several resources out there, though. I will say that Wiley treatment planners are amazing. So if you don't already have one, you should definitely invest in one. If you can't afford one, send me an email. I'll see what I can do. doclqj at familialbonds.org. So yeah, that's it. So you guys have a great one. Later days.